Thank you and welcome, Gauri. It's only a pleasure to have you here with us today. Now, seeing that we are limited on time, I'm going to dive straight into the conversation. But before doing so, I just wanted to provide some context. IRENA recently released a report specifically titled Delivering on the UAE Consensus, where it specifically highlights the data which shows that the 2030 target of tripling renewables and doubling on energy efficiency remains actually within reach. So that gives us hope, knowing that the acceleration of the energy transition is very much realistic. Further, the report shows that the pace of global renewables power deployment continues to improve at a staggering 582 gigawatts of additional capacity, which was installed capacity at 2024, which really represents a 15.1% increase. Now, as much as this is a slight shortfall, it provides hope that the new global deployment record is still maintained at a high level for the third consecutive year. We've just come out of COP30, and two specific points that I want to highlight before going into the questions was utilities have committed to a sharp increasing in investments, with utilities for net zero pledging $150 billion a year towards grids, storage, and renewables. Now, with this being said, acceleration should be equitable, just, and clean. So, Gauri, I ask you the first question. How would you assess the energy transition or the real state of the global energy transition today, as we see major shifts in geopolitical leadership, policy directions, and market momentum? So particularly in light of US's absence at COP30 and on the decarbonization landscapes.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me here. And it's a pleasure to be speaking to you. You're absolutely right about the headwinds that we see renewables facing, especially in light of the position that the US has taken. And naturally, being one of the largest countries and economies, the COP at Belém, I was told, it didn't have the same heft, naturally. But, you're absolutely right about the utilities actually shaping up and taking on a much more proactive role. And that's very much needed, because when we talk about electrification, then we are really talking about a momentum that has been built over the last few years. You mentioned, that last year we had nearly 585 gigawatts getting added. And another very important point is that whatever is the incremental increase that is happening in the global capacity for electrification, 90% is coming from renewables. So we're already on track to build the additionality coming from renewables. Also, given that the cost of renewables in most of the regions are absolutely the most competitive. So, the challenges that are being faced now is as more and more intermittent renewables gets added, which is solar and wind, naturally the capacities of the grids gets stretched and needs investment both in flexibility and resilience to be able to cope up with this intermittence. I definitely think for the utilities to take this proactive pledge and to move forward with investments is a great thing. But just to give you a sense that overall, if we had to look at what is needed annually in the grids and for investment, it's nearly to the tune of about $670 billion. So it's a lot. And if you add to it the storage and the flexibility components, then that goes up to nearly 900 billion. So we're still not there. So despite the fact that you have about $2.4, $2.5 trillion getting invested overall in in the energy transition investment, of which 1/3 is coming to renewables. We do expect that from now to 2030, which is really the critical years, the growth has been exponential. So it's not, as you already mentioned, that there have been record years. We do hope that this year it will keep pace and we will see nearly 700 gigawatts getting installed. And that actually gives us that hope that we still have that small window of opportunity. It's a very small window of opportunity, and it's getting closed very quickly. But I think there's still hope because of this momentum, which is both political, coming from the private sector, and for technology providers being there on the ground, having the ability to deploy very fast.
You touched based on a bit of the diversified energy mix of speaking about storage, and you mentioned that 90% of the 586 gigawatts was actually renewables. We still see that, and you've mentioned in your response that storage grid flexibility still remains equally a challenge. How do you see this pace? As much as we see the acceleration of renewables in the market, how do you see the pace of the grid storage and flexibility equally important for renewable development as well?
So I think, we need to look at what the ecosystem in the grid space really looks like. And how does it compare to the ecosystem of the deployment of renewables that's happening at the space that we see. When we look at where the money is coming from for the deployment of renewables, then nearly 75% comes from the private sector. So this is really, the momentum is really coming from the private sector. It could be supplying the electricity to the grid, or 1/3 actually the market is now very dynamic, and it is supplying directly to third parties. So that's a huge market that's being built. In the case of grids, what we see is most of the countries have the grid operators being government. So there is still a reluctance to bring in the private sector to help in the investment process. But I think, the reforms that we need to see in how the private sector can participate in expanding the grids, in strengthening the grids, this is really going to be the key where we will see the kind of momentum in some countries, but not in all. So I would say market reform, definitely. And the other big factor which would bring in investments is the electricity markets getting more robust. And since we're sitting in the UAE, we have a very strong GCC grid. But GCC grid is not really used for market transactions. It is mostly like a backup, because all the countries are so strong in being able to produce their own electricity. So I think if I look at also this region, the important factor would be to see how the interconnections build up with the other regions. We are seeing the interconnection that is developing between Saudi and Egypt, and then taking it on to Europe. But also the interconnection that has been talked about between India and the region. So these interconnections are very critical when we see how, and we do a projection of how we see not just the renewables market growing, but also how investments in the grids will come in this region.
Which actually brings me to the next point about regional context and regional interconnections. We've seen Middle East, specifically UAE, Saudi Arabia, having a lot of the gigawatt renewable projects, but you've mentioned and touched base of the stability within each of these countries. Do you see, from an IRENA's perspective, a cross-border energy trade evolve to support that decentralized generation models, maybe through corporate PPA structures, to drive that deeper decarbonization?
I think, the interconnections, the cross-border is going to be much more important in renewables than what we see currently. And perhaps I can give you an example, maybe not from the region, but of what is happening in the ASEAN countries. Just to show and demonstrate how the pushes and pulls of demand and supply are really working to create the momentum in a region where we, just a couple of years back, we didn't see that kind of momentum. So Singapore, as we all know, is a huge energy demand center. And they have these data centers, global data centers, where the global mandate of these organizations is now to go green. Since they're located in Singapore, they actually came to the government and said that we will be able to remain in Singapore only if you can provide us green electrons. And Singapore, given the geographic constraints, had already done rooftop solar and whatever it could. And then, because of this kind of a demand push that came from the data centers and other such enterprises, they had to start speaking to their neighbors. And the neighbors meaning Malaysia to Indonesia to Laos. And this was not a conversation that was happening before. And now, I was in Malaysia just in October, and I was so surprised to see how dramatically the things have changed, where Singapore is almost becoming like the catalyst for these regional interconnections to start functioning, electricity market to start functioning in the region. And I think that is possibly what holds the key for us to see how these regions will become the big blocks of where not just deployment will happen, but also cross-border trade.
So there is hope for regional expansions. From Asia to Africa. So a bit on the emerging markets, where we see intermittent renewable power, governments having limited public funding or financing to strengthen the grid flexibilities and resilience, while still accelerating the needs to deploy clean energy. What do you see as blended finance models or policy tools to help these governments in keeping clean energy still affordable, equitable, but specifically bringing the inclusion of talent, localization, and community resilience as part of the whole just energy transition? I know it's quite a loaded question.
No, I think it's a very important question, something that occupies governments, policymakers, and it occupies a lot of their time, because there are no easy answers. And there are also competing demands for public finance. But I think the countries where they have actually done well are the ones where they've used public finance to de-risk their policy. And there are many mechanisms that can be used, risk guarantee mechanisms and multiple others. But I think the governments that have used the public finance to catalyze investments from outside, using their public finance to de-risk their policy, have been very successful. The other good examples are where there is a large enough domestic market. You do also see local content playing out well. Now, naturally, if the domestic market is not large enough, then even if you put a condition of local market, you will not attract any investments. It might be something that the governments want, but it doesn't play out well. So that's when the regional alignment becomes very important. And if there is a strong regional alignment to bring in jobs, to bring in manufacturing, to have the strong and critical elements of the supply chain in the region, and there is a cohesion of interest of the countries in that region, that's when you can have a strong policy which attracts investment but also gets manufacturing and jobs in the region. But as I said, this is not something all countries can do by themselves. We've seen it in Indonesia, where they have very, very strong resources. And what they have said is that if you want to mine our resources, then you also need to set up some value-added manufacturing in the country. So it does vary, but I think the critical point that I want to re-emphasize is that given the kind of constraints that governments have in terms of their own resources, and they're all competing with each other to attract investment, the governments that can best do de-risking of their policy are the ones that will get investments in.
I see the big red screen, time's up. So to wrap up very quickly in a few words, what does IRENA see as non-negotiables for a just transition, whether starting from this year or next year to the next 5 years to the 2030 goal?
I think it'll have to be the continued momentum on the deployment of renewables on the ground, because that, along with the investments that are needed to support the infrastructure growth, I think those two, to my mind, would be the most critical.
So thank you for that. I appreciate it. I know that there's not much time for questions. I'm respectful of the next session, so thank you so much, Gauri. It was only a pleasure to have a fireside chat about.
Thanks so much, Daxita.